So I'm going to start just by giving a bit of background on kind of where I come from with this research, and how it's kind of situated in the landscape of work on landscape of scholarship on urban regeneration, specifically thinking about the huge body of work that has developed about East London and in East London over the last kind of 40 years or so. So I'm an anthropologist by background. I've always worked in interdisciplinary contexts though, so I've been at UCL for the last 10 years. Before that, I was at the Young Foundation, which is an independent research institute in East London. And the kind of thread that's kind of run through all of the work that I've done over the last 20 years or so has been thinking about the politics of knowledge production. So who gets to, what kinds of data and information and evidence are used to make decisions about urban regeneration? So from a planning point of view, policy, decision making, but then whose knowledge is that? Whose voices are heard in that process, and who gets to kind of shape the, frame the problems, but also then produce and use the knowledge. And I look at urban regeneration kind of from the perspective of thinking about it as a future kind of imaginary of a good life. So from a plan making point of view, planners and policymakers are, investing all kinds of concepts in this policy. So thinking about social mobility, sometimes thinking about renewal of or kind of retrofit and renewal of housing, thinking also about how regeneration as a policy and a programme of work is intended to bring kind of economic benefits to an area. So what I try to do is look at regen as a policy concept, as a practice. So thinking about what policymakers are doing day to day, and the knowledge that they're using to kind of design policy, but then also how all of the other stakeholders, so the built environment professionals and practitioners, so architects, planners who work in the private sector, people who are delivering regeneration programs on the ground, are translating those policies and concepts and putting them into practice. And then also looking at the lived experience of regeneration. So what's it like to see your neighbourhood change and potentially be dislocated or displaced in that process? So yeah, so the kind of core question that I'm always really interested in is what counts as data and evidence and knowledge. And there's a huge amount of different kinds of data and different types of research and information that are used to inform policy. But I'm particularly interested, or have become particularly interested in the last kind of 15 years or so, in indicators and metrics. And how they're used in the context of urban regeneration planning, both to make a case for change and kind of legitimize action, and also then to measure the outcomes of transformation, essentially. So I'm particularly interested in indicators because of the kind of prior work that I've been doing with policymakers and practitioners, thinking about or observing, essentially, kind of ethnographically looking at how they use concepts and evidence in their kind of day-to-day work, and seeing how powerful certain forms of evidence, and in particular kind of indicators and metrics, are. And there's a whole body of work, obviously, that looks at indicators and metrics and their kind of external neutrality and objectivity, but critiquing that because obviously they are social constructs. They're designed, and all kinds of ideological and political and other agendas are built into the creation of those metrics in ways that are often not obvious. So I'm particularly interested in indicators and how they're used, but also how particular concepts have traction or develop traction at different points in time. So I've kind of been working in this space for about 25 years, and it's really interesting to see, obviously there's been different changes of government centrally and also, locally. It's been really interesting to see how certain policy concepts are picked up and translated and kind of move through time and change the language as kind of political environments change. But it's not just about the kind of political, it's also thinking about which ideas gain traction in the kind of professional practice world. So thinking about things like how, sustainable communities concepts were very popular and linked to things like the Sustainable Communities Agenda, but went off in all kinds of other directions in the broader kind of professional practice world. So one of the concepts which is kind of very current in the work that I do at the moment is social value. So when I'm talking to primarily the kind of the regeneration partnerships and the public-private partnerships, that I'm kind of looking at thinking about social value and the Social Value Act and the social value frameworks that are used to measure success. That's one of those concepts that has a lot of traction at the moment, even though at the same time, those practitioners are quite critical of the fact that it's just monetizing indicators and there are different alternatives. So that's a kind of long way of introducing the kind of things that I'm interested in, and it gives a bit of background to this particular piece of work that I'm going to talk about today, which is the Citizen Prosperity Index. So this is something that I've been working on at UCL for 10 years, and the idea behind this is we wanted to look at what might change if citizens and communities are involved in determining what the outcomes of regeneration should look like. And this builds on, obviously, a really long history of work, both in the community, but also scholarship that looks at regeneration as a policy, but also kind of, urban theory around regeneration and dynamics of change, but looking specifically in East London at the different waves of regeneration that have taken place since the closure of the Docklands. Obviously, this is Canary Wharf, and many people would say, me included, that it is an example of how not to do regeneration. So, from a conventional kind of metrics point of view, it's been successful in terms of attracting high-profile employers, creating jobs, driving kind of GDP and GVA, but highly unsuccessful in terms of delivering spillover benefits to the low-income neighbourhoods around, and in fact also causing issues around social cohesion. So if this is what successful regeneration looks like from a kind of a central government policymaker perspective and a kind of economist perspective, what would change essentially if citizens are involved in saying, these are the things that matter to me and these are the outcomes that I would like to see measured. This work, as I said, is situated in a kind of really extensive landscape of work on urban regeneration, and this is just a few of the topics that my work engages with, and just a few of the multiple authors that have been looking at these topics. And then, of course, there's all of the work that goes on in this department, specifically around kind of housing and exclusion too. So this work is situated, I suppose, in relation to work looking at gentrification, displacement and exclusion. Looking at housing and the impact of urban regeneration on residents, but also businesses. So looking at work by Loretta Lees, and then specifically in East London and around the Olympic legacy, Paul Watt, Phil Cohen, Juliet Davis, Penny Bernstock have all done work that's been looking specifically at the Olympic legacy regeneration, which is kind of the starting point for my work. Also work looking at community-led regeneration. How communities can be involved in the kind of co-production of plans, but also mechanisms like community land trusts and community, community-owned and managed assets. So kind of connecting with those issues around power and voice. Obviously, there's a whole body of work that looks at neoliberalization and financialization and governance and the complexity of regeneration partnerships and the kind of public-private dynamic, and how that, connects to huge changes in the kind of housing market, both in terms of the delivery of housing, but also, also our experience as individual dwellers. And then I suppose the fourth area is around discourse and the construction of social policy problems. So this is something that I'm really interested in the context of the kind of politics of knowledge that are used to generate data and evidence about urban regeneration. So my work is kind of here in the middle, touching on all of these areas. And the key questions are, as I said, it's like what forms of knowledge are used, which concepts have traction, and importantly, what kinds of action does this then enable and legitimize in terms of making claims for regeneration to happen, or making claims about where it has or hasn't been successful. Just before I kind of talk about the project a bit more, and there's one piece of work I think that has been particularly influential in the design of this study, and it's Andrew Talon's kind of concept of having dual landscapes. So anyone who's done any work on regeneration or estate renewal knows quantitatively, qualitatively, empirically that the benefits of urban regeneration are uneven. Inequalities are often spatially concentrated. These processes of transformation intensify inequalities that are already there. But thinking, Talon kind of uses this idea of dual landscapes, so these inequalities sitting side by side, which is something that both the communities that I work with talk about a lot in terms of their individual and collective and kind of everyday experience of transformation and exclusion, those feelings of exclusion, but also the kind of the policymakers and the regen planners as well, in terms of understanding that there is this unevenness, and having certain kind of tools like the indices of multiple deprivation and other data which talks about kind of poverty and inequality, but not necessarily knowing or feeling like they have the tools to be able to act on these inequalities that they see. And that's not to say, obviously, there isn't a gigantic body of work and there isn't a huge amount of evidence, but something I hear, not only in the work I'm doing now, but have heard kind of consistently in all of the work I've done with planners and policymakers, is like, we don't have the right metrics. We don't have those metrics at the right scale, or we don't have the right indicators, and that's partly about, the kind of dynamics of local authority change and intelligence teams being deconstructed and, people changing jobs a lot. So, there is knowledge that is kind of lost in this constant change, but there's also a sense that day to day, they don't have quite the right tools. So we were trying to kind of look at this and say, what difference might it make to your understanding, and what difference might it make to the kind of the voice and the opportunities for citizens and communities to input to framing problems and being part of the conversation about outcomes if the metrics are co-designed with citizens. So the context for this work is the Olympic legacy, the Olympic Legacy Regeneration Programme in East London. This is what I started my PhD was about the planning of some of the neighbourhoods, the legacy communities, neighbourhoods. UCL is also part of this kind of regeneration programme because we have a new campus in the Olympic Park, so part of that kind of transformation programme. So 10 years ago, there was a lot of interest in working with a set of stakeholders who are responsible for this programme and saying, you know, we're coming in as part of this regeneration program. How can we kind of better understand what's going on? But you will be familiar with the convergence framework and action plan. So the kind of the key promise of the legacy regeneration was that within 20 years of the Games, the gaps in prospects and prosperity between East London and West London would be closed. So there would be the same opportunities for people living in East London, and that the regeneration programme itself, in terms of the new housing, the new economic opportunities, would deliver for local communities. So that was articulated in lots of different ways in the legacy plans, but in the bid and kind of throughout those plans, the promise was about local benefit. So we were particularly interested in kind of interrogating that. So the starting point for this work then was to work with a group of citizen social scientists. So these are residents who live in neighbourhoods in the Olympic Park and in the fringes of the park. So we worked with people who are living in East Village, which was the athletes' village, in Hackney Wick, in kind of areas in Hackney Wick, Fish Island, Bow, and Leighton, and Stratford. So in the park and kind of on the fringes. People living in these neighbourhoods who had been living in these neighbourhoods for a while, with the exception of East Village, because people had only been living there for a couple of years at the time of this work, to train them, have them working alongside the academic research team, have them helping us to design qualitative research that would reach a whole range of different people living in their neighbourhoods, and to bring their kind of lived perspective into the research process, and to help us prosperity. What does it mean to you to live a good life? In generation process, what do you see, what do you not see, what opportunities do you have? And then thinking about that idea of a good life, it's like what supports it and what are the specific obstacles? And we wanted to focus on these questions because we wanted to look at people's lived experience, but also to have a kind of temporal dimension to the work as well. So it's like, what am I experiencing now? What are my kind of future aspirations? And what are how do the structural inequalities kind of affect people in their everyday lives? I think I might have lost the slide. So we worked with this team for about 4 months. They were paid, trained, worked alongside the team, collected extensive amounts of qualitative data. We had 250 accounts that they collected in their neighbourhoods. We went through a collective process of coding, analysing, and interpreting that data, and then an exercise to translate the high-level themes into a model that was a visual representation of the determinants of prosperity for people living in East London. Find it. Yes, so this is what they came up with. So a multi-dimensional representation of a good life. I'm not going to go through all of the details of the indicators here, just because of time. But there's a detailed kind of methodological note about how we actually developed this model and the qualitative work that sits behind it, and then how the index that we then construct has been put together. But what's important conceptually is that the determinants. So the model is multidimensional. There's a very strong emphasis in the things that people said were important on security and inclusion. So when I say security, I mean security of housing, security of tenure, security of work, and inclusion in both the kind of economic and the social life of the city. And that really came from the sense that at the time, so this is 10 years ago, but this still applies today. People were experiencing kind of extreme insecurity in East London. So in terms of the threat of potential displacement, but low wage work, 0 hours contracts, extremely unaffordable housing, very insecure tenures. So security came out as being a really kind of critical driver of prosperity, as did access to services and opportunities, and feelings of choice and control and hopefulness and belonging, and a whole range of issues around public health, obviously, but also voice and influence. So just going back to the Olympic legacy promise. So the convergence concept that I just talked about, the convergence framework has a range of different indicators that we used to kind of measure and report on the success of that closing the gap promise, essentially. So you can see here a report from the Growth Boroughs Partnership that was published in 2016 that looks in a very simple way at whether they are on track to meet these targets and what had happened in terms of change between 2009 and 2015. But I put this here because I wanted to kind of show you the kinds of indicators that were being used, because they're quite typical of the kinds of measurement frameworks that come out of policy contexts where there's the kind of expert-led and technocratic and quite focused on the use of secondary data and available data. So it's like they're measuring what can be measured as opposed to what should be measured. So here we're looking at things like educational attainment, obviously really important stuff. Educational attainment, unemployment, percentage of working age population with no qualifications, median earnings, but they're very much about kind of counting, whereas the work that the citizen scientists identified was much more about kind of subjective experiences of change as well. And I'm not saying at all that the convergence framework indicators are things that shouldn't be measured. They should, but I think these things also give a better indication of what it's like to actually live through change. So because of time, I could talk about this for hours, but I won't. Because of time, I would only kind of like pick out one thing that emerged from the qualitative work that we translated into the index that I think is really important. So qualitative work, obviously we identified with the citizen scientists the different dimensions, the different determinants of prosperity, which you can see here in the model. But another key distinction that came out of that qual was that people made a distinction between what the foundations of prosperity, so the things that are absolutely essential in order to get by kind of day to day and to have any chance of flourishing in the long term, and then the kind of the longer term opportunities. So in the model, we call that the foundations of prosperity. And the first foundation is livelihood security. And this is then broken down into what people said they need. So it's kind of an overlapping set of assets. It's not just about having one of these things or two of these things. They're kind of overlapping assets and resources and networks that people draw on that they need to get by. Securing common good quality work, genuinely affordable and secure housing, freedom from financial stress, food and energy security, feeling secure about the future. So it's like, am I likely to be able to stay in my neighbourhood while I have to leave because I can't afford the housing? And then access to key basic services that are linked to people's kind of livelihoods and ability to work or volunteer. So things like public transport, digital inclusion, and childcare that is genuinely affordable. So we've used that model, and as one part of the Prosperity in East London longitudinal study. So this is a longitudinal study that we launched in 2021. It's a mixed method study that's running for 10 years. There's 3 waves of data collection. The first one was in 21. We're just planning the second wave, which will take place, start at the end of this year and run next year. And then there will be a third wave of data collection in 2930, and the study will finish in 2031. So there's kind of two key questions that we're looking at here. So it's like the first one is who benefits and how from regeneration investments. So this kind of comes back to what I was saying about Andrew Talon's dual landscapes idea, that there's a huge amount of literature that looks at the unequal and kind of uneven benefits of regeneration. But when it comes to the kind of the specific cases and really understanding in detail how the kind of promises of regeneration do or don't play out in particular areas, and specifically between kind of new neighbourhoods, so we'll most likely have a new population or a population with a different kind of demographic characteristic, and established low-income neighbourhoods that are meant to be, in the narrative of regeneration policy, often meant to be the beneficiaries, but are not. So that's what the first question is looking at. We're using the index as the tool to do that, and to focus at a hyper-local level, so we can kind of really investigate those that local distribution of benefits. And then the second element of the study, so for each of the waves, we've got the index, and there's also a qualitative wave of work that is carried out by citizen scientists, and we're exploring obstacles to prosperity for people from different backgrounds. Just very quickly, this is where the study is going on. So the initial kind of qualitative work that I've just described started in the Olympic Park. So the first wave of it was done in the Olympic Park, and then we did a second wave of it in these kind of neighbourhoods in the south of Newham, just to kind of finalise and test and validate the qualitative model. But the longitudinal study is looking at 4 kind of study areas that kind of represent different types of urban regeneration. And we're doing it at a hyper-local level. So it's 15 lower super output areas that are clustered into these study areas. So there's one in and around the Olympic Park, which includes the new neighbourhoods in the park and in Hackney Wick, and the kind of established low-income neighbourhoods around them. So we call that the Olympic Park and the fringes. The second one is the Royal Docks in the south of Newham, that includes North Woolwich, Beckton, Custom House, Canning Town, and Silvertown. So the new development that's going on in Silvertown. So those two are kind of similar in a sense that they're large-scale, long-term strategic regeneration programs, public-private partnerships, a lot of new development, a lot of displacement that has happened in the context of the Olympic Park, but a lot of new development. But where regeneration is also meant to be doing a lot of other things as well. So, in terms of economic development, enterprise, innovation, delivering improvements in public health and well-being. This study area we call the TV estate. So this is an estate renewal, estate regeneration program, so slightly different character. And then we have an area in Barking in Heath Ward in Dagenham, which is kind of proximate to university-led regeneration going on there, but there's nothing happening specifically in the neighbourhood, but it's still been envisaged as an area that should benefit. So the first, well, all 3 of the waves, the Citizen Prosperity Index aspect of the longitudinal study is based on a household survey of 4,000 households in those 15 areas that we've commissioned and collected. So it's been designed as a representative sample, both within the LSOAs and for the study overall. So what you can see here is one of the spider charts that looks at all of the different subdomains. There's also then kind of breaks down into more detailed indicators underneath, but the different subdomains that make up the prosperity index. So we're able to compare then the local spatial patterns of experience for all of the sites, then between the kind of the new and established areas, and look at who is doing well in the terms identified locally. So if these are the desired outcomes of regeneration as kind of communities have identified them, what's going on? So the index is quite straightforward. 0 means low scores, so not doing well in this domain. 10 is doing very well. And you can see like there's really very different experiences going on, basically. So the spatial patterns of inequality are quite specific to the places. So this orange one here that you can see is Leighton. So this is an LSOA that is just on the east of the Olympic Park, and the Olympic Park regeneration legacy was meant to kind of connect the kind of new and established neighbourhoods and spill over the benefits. So what we can see here is like really high levels of financial stress, people really struggling financially in this particular area. This is all online and kind of available to play with. So please, go and have a look around. You can look at all of the different indicators and the different patterns that are going on. But I suppose what I wanted to talk about is what this work can do, essentially. So not necessarily the findings of the index, but the process of having citizen-led metrics and having citizens kind of in dialogue with policymakers and planners. So what I was just showing you were kind of index scores from the first wave of the longitudinal study, thinking about this kind of new and established, the new and established categories, which I accept are quite a crude way to think about it, but as a tool, it's quite useful. Unsurprisingly, if we look at the prosperity scores for people living in new neighbourhoods, they tend to be doing much better than people living in established neighbourhoods. That's not a surprise to anyone here. But I think what's interesting is that because we've got this hyperlocal data, we're able to quantify and situate this idea of kind of dual landscapes in a slightly different way. So we're able to look at not only kind of income inequalities and poverty and the issues that are reported on and things like the IMD, but a whole range of indicators that are related to security. So we can look at, specific kind of differences in terms of financial stress or levels of income security. So we're able to kind of situate and quantify this concept of duality in a way that we weren't able to do before. So what difference does it make? So last year we did some work looking at comparing these stories of success, essentially. If you look at the story of Olympic legacy regeneration impact from a convergence framework perspective, using the measures that in that framework and the kind of the geographies in that framework versus what this kind of hyperlocal approach tells you. So the table on the left-hand side is from that report, basically looking at how the growth boroughs have performed. So the growth boroughs are what were the Olympic host boroughs. And here you can see kind of highlighted in blue the borough averages, and then the individual boroughs are listed above. So unsurprisingly, there's been population growth, there's been employment growth, there's been business growth, and there's been resident earnings growth. So on one hand, the kind of economic indicators, which are the ones that tend to be talked about the most, are telling a story of kind of positive impact. If you look back to the other indicators in the convergence framework in terms of movement on health and well-being and crime, there's not such a positive story, but these are the ones that tend to be kind of pulled out. But when we look at it from a hyperlocal level and really focus in on issues around security and livelihoods and genuine affordability, then we get quite a different picture. about what's going on. And I think for me, one of the most interesting things about this work has been looking at kind of stress and insecurity in across all of the different areas. So we see that there are levels of insecurity. Everyone is experiencing quite high levels of insecurity, livelihood insecurity, regardless of their income. So even in new neighbourhoods like East Village and Chobham Manor in the Olympic Park, where the population is younger, in professional occupations with significantly higher incomes, there are still very high levels of insecurity and financial stress because of the housing, because of the costs of housing. And of all of the 15 areas that we're looking at, it's that particular LSOA where people feel most insecure about the future and most likely to have to leave because of not just housing, but cost of living, but housing is a really key part of that. So much higher levels of insecurity than, say, in areas like Canning Town, where, you know, the future of regeneration has been uncertain for 20 years or so. This is just a different way of looking at it. So we mapped livelihood security using secondary data as a point of comparison. So using the citizen design model, but using secondary data. So just quickly then, I think for me, one of the things that's important about this work is that it's situated within a framework and within a partnership. So there's a kind of framework for decision making around it. So it's very much driven, the initial kind of qualitative design work is very much driven by the citizen scientists and the community partners. But once we had that qualitative work and that model, we set up something called the London Prosperity Board. So this is a multi-stakeholder partnership that's been running for 10 years. And it includes these partners and more, so a whole range of different stakeholders who have an vested interest in the kind of outcomes of regeneration in East London, but have different levers. Some are thinking about planning, some are investing in regen, some are delivering regen schemes, some are delivering public services, some are kind of like on the front line, delivering kind of support services to communities, and then others are thinking about the research environment. So for us, it was important to put these indicators in a partnership where there could be a dialogue between partners about the relevance and the relevance of different kinds of knowledge, the difficulty that policymakers sometimes encounter when trying to use qualitative research to inform policy, and to take them kind of on a journey of like collective learning, essentially. So it's capacity building for everybody. It's like, so, you know, how can we work together to put these things into practice? So the longitudinal study has been co-funded and co-designed by this group of partners, although it's important to say that UCL has the kind of is responsible for delivery of the study. So no one is able to intervene or you know, suggest that unhelpful findings should not be published, let's say. So this kind of trans-disciplinary partnership way of working, I think, is really important. And obviously it only makes a difference if it's only useful if it's actually kind of making a difference. So we are working with these partners to kind of think about the journey of putting this into strategy and policy. But that's taken 10 years. So obviously then there's a long kind of lag to see if any of it actually makes things into kind of practice, and then what happens as a result. So I'm going to stop there. Yeah, thanks very much.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So we've got 10-15 minutes now for any Q&A and discussion. For those online, if you'd like to raise a virtual hand or type